Hi guys, hold on for a second. Before we proceed to the video, I have something very important to tell you. Professor Jon V. Kofas has published his new book in collaboration with Little French Media, and the title of the book is Neoliberalism, Inequality, and Authoritarianism. This book details how neoliberalism impacts the geopolitical economy in the 21st century. You can buy it from Amazon and the link is in the description. Thank you. Now let's proceed to the video.
Good morning and welcome to a session on a very significant topic. I would say the most significant topic of 2023 and 2024 still going on is genocide taking place in Gaza. This is not a question of merely Israelis against Palestinians and vice versa. Israelis accusing Palestinians of terrorism, Hamas, and identifying all of the Palestinian people, close 6 million, with Hamas, that the entity. But rather, it is a question about how humanity, how states deal with crimes against humanity. I'm mentioning this because there have been, the International Criminal Court has rendered its decision on the issue of genocide in Gaza. The fact is that there have been arrest warrants for the head of state of Israel, yet there are governments, beginning with the United States, which refuse to recognize the validity of international law and international legal institutions. It struck me as very important that the Archbishop of Canterbury just recently, a couple of days ago in England, issued a statement on this. He pointed out that it is time all governments without exception, abide by international law, abide by the decisions of the international community and the organs that of the United Nations, like the ICC and the ICJ, and that this would in fact establish a solid foundation for a world order based on the rule of law, not rhetoric, vacuous rhetoric that the West supposedly supports rule of law, when in fact it refuses to abide by the Geneva Convention as applied to Israel and selectively chooses which country is guilty of genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity and which country is not. So the Bishop of Canterbury's statement in England is very significant in that regard. And we do know that the papacy in Rome also has, its thinking is also along these lines. So both the Catholic Church and the Anglican Church are in agreement on this issue of a universal application with regard to the very significant issue of genocide applied across the board without cherry-picking policies intended to serve political agendas. I want to make sure that people understand that the issue of genocide is very controversial, not just because of the certain states in the West, namely deciding that the global South and Russia and China are the ones that international law should apply to when it comes to human rights and human rights violations and war crimes issues, but that the issue here is about the future. In other words, one reason I'm doing this session on genocide, and as a historian, I'm going to take a historical approach and go back and point out some historical examples from actually Athens during the Peloponnesian Wars, then Rome during the Punic Wars in Carthage, and all the way to Palestine. The reason this is important is what legacy is this going to leave for the future? What precedent is this setting for the future? And one of the reasons that I pointed out the position of the Church of England, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Justin Welby, as well as the Vatican, is because they are at least recognizing that this is a moral issue. And by the way, let me point out that in philosophy, which of course has ethics as one of its subjects, genocide is in a unique, separate category. It's the worst of all moral lapses of humanity. If Dante Alighieri, the great Italian Renaissance writer, had to rewrite the Inferno, the lowest circle of hell in the Inferno, the ninth circle, would not be treachery, but rather genocide. There is nothing worse in humanity. Now, let me point out that there have been more than 10,000 books written on genocide. Hundreds of thousands of articles, scholarly as well as journal articles, newspaper articles on this subject. So clearly humanity has had an interest in this. The 20th century was the worst century for genocide, obviously with the horrific Holocaust, which the Third Reich carried out during the era of Adolf Hitler. However, there have been others, and they go back in history. Historians do not agree on exactly what constitutes genocide. So let me begin by defining the term. The term genocide, the word itself, is actually the first part, genos, which is Greek, which means tribe, ethnic group, if you will. And this is where we get the word genetic from, by the way, as well. And cide is Latin, which means killing. Genocide was coined by, I believe, by a State Department official when they were investigating the Holocaust. The term itself is indicative that this refers to mass killings. The Geneva Convention of 1949, Article 2 of the Geneva Convention, spells out very specifically, but according to some scholars as well as politicians, very narrowly, what constitutes, what is the criteria for genocide? And one of the reasons that we have states, we have governments to this day, by the way, with the United States inviting recently, just a few days ago, the head of state of Israel, who for whom there is a warrant for his arrest as a war criminal, inviting this individual in head of a state which has been accused of genocide And yet the United States invites him to speak before Congress and legitimize that state carrying on genocide even just recently, a couple of days ago. In other words, after the speech by Netanyahu in the US Congress, an international organization pointed out that Israel is not just carrying out mass destruction in terms of hitting hospitals and schools. A war crime, but these are war crimes, by the way. I want to make it very clear. Bombing hospitals and schools and refugee centers is illegal. It's a war crime. But besides that, they have weaponized water and food. And there is an estimated 2 million people on the edge of starvation in Gaza. That is also part of the equation. And yet, there are a number of countries that refuse to do anything about it. This is one of the reasons that Justin Welby, the Archbishop of Canterbury, came out and said, enough is enough. We have to apply a single standard across the world, no exceptions for political reasons, no exceptions whatsoever. And this is an issue for what kind of precedent is this setting down the road? Because if they make an exception here, why should anyone abide by international law? Why should any country down the road not violate international law, the Geneva Convention? Why should anyone abide by the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice? So this is a very significant issue. Let me note, by the way, that the Geneva Convention does have a narrow, as I started to say, a narrow definition. And this is actually controversial. And the narrow definition argues that the criteria should be that when government or an organized group is targeting for extermination other group or groups on the basis of religion, religious prejudice, in other words, ethnicity, nationality, and marginalizes these people and demonizes them and targets them for extermination. Basically, they do not include, and this is the controversy, they do not include governments which pursue a policy in order to induce conformity of their own population within certain perimeters of their policy. Let me just be specific on this one. Stalin carried out mass elimination of a number of people, but specifically Ukrainians, in the early 1930s, in the early years of the Great Depression. Although, by the way, Russia was not impacted by the Great Depression because it was outside the capitalist world economy. In fact, it was the only country that wasn't impacted. But Stalin was outside of this, is not included based on this definition because he was trying to impose a policy that would force a segment of the population at that time, of course, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, to abide by the collectivization and state-owned farms of the Kremlin. The other controversy, of course, is what happened in Kampuchea under Pol Pot as Khmer Rouge in the early 1970s, actually, throughout the 1970s, which was, of course, the Khmer Rouge turning against their own people. Now, that's a very complicated issue, and I'm going to try to address some of that, depending how much time we have today. But I'm going to try to address that. That's a really complicated issue because Vietnam was involved, obviously, as you know, this was during the Vietnam War, the later period of the Vietnam War. China, Russia, and sadly, the United States. So the question is, okay, why is it that those examples, those criteria are not included? And of course, scholars do on their own include them. So depending on whether you have a minimalist definition based on the Geneva Convention of Article 2, or you have a much broader definition, genocide cases range from 3-4 dozen to closer to 130. I've counted as many as 150 for some. So there are a lot of genocide cases that have taken place. Most have taken place in the 20th century, and the most documented and live broadcast genocide is the one taking place today in Gaza. I mean, there's more videotape and more photographs of this than, obviously, because of technology. We live in the age of high tech. You can't get away from this. And sadly, the enthusiasts of the what they call the war against terror, and by terror they mean the Palestinians. They're all terrorists, of course, because they're all identified with Hamas. They're potential even babies. They're potential Hamas fighters in the future. This is a very public genocide. And sadly, as I started to say, there are people who have, including soldiers, Israeli soldiers, but also civilians, who have publicly celebrated the eliminations, the systematic elimination of the other side of the minority population, namely the Palestinians, which the ICC rendered its decision, of course, and of course there is an arrest warrant for the head of that state. Now, genocide is not new to history. I don't believe I want to start with, and I've dealt with this in another session on human nature and war, but I'm going to repeat that point that I made in that particular video, that whether there is something innate in human nature that makes human beings prone to being warmongers, as some have argued, like animals in the jungle. I categorically deny that there is scientific evidence for that. There isn't any. There is evidence, however, that the elites conducting policy for war, including genocide, which is, of course, the worst form of warfare, are prone to that. So it's not human nature in general, but the elites, for their own ideological, political, cultural, social, and economic reasons, are in fact prone to that. So I'm going to make it very clear that there is nothing innate in the average human being to desire genocide. This is unnatural. And of course, psychologists, and I must mention that one of my reactions as I began to see that that this genocidal war in Gaza was not going anywhere when it started, and month after month it was just getting worse and worse. One of my reactions was that indeed there is a need for psychologists to delve into this. Why are people so indoctrinated to the degree by the hegemonic culture, the dominant culture, to the degree that they celebrate genocide, that they publicly admit before cameras that yes, we want them dead? And this is a curious issue. I still don't believe there is anything innate in human beings, that in fact this ideological fanaticism has been inculcated into the mind of human beings by the hegemonic culture, which has its agenda to carry out, whether it's some messianic vision, like in the case of the Zionist state, or others, as we will see when we discuss very briefly the Armenian genocide. Let me begin by very briefly going to the ancient world. In the ancient times, the great historian, Athenian historian Thucydides, did touch on this issue when he indirectly and very subtly. Thucydides was a brilliant scholar, very subtle, very subtle. He never hit the audience over the head with a hammer on the points he made. When he discussed how Athens reduced the island of Milos, which is a beautiful island, by the way, reduced the island of Milos to subjugation, forced them to, they were trying to blackmail them to either ally with them or Sparta, although they argued that they wanted to be neutral, neither side. They didn't want to be on either side. And then they, of course, went in and they slaughtered the adult males and enslaved the rest of the population. This was sort of genocide in the political, if you follow the maximalist definition. But the big one in ancient times was the Third Punic War. Carthage. This was, there were two major maritime powers, trading powers during the second century BC, during the era of the Roman Republic, the ascendancy of the Roman Republic. One was on the coast of North Africa. These were Phoenician traders in Carthage, Tunisia, today. There were merchants. They were all over the Mediterranean world, from the British Isles all the way to modern-day Lebanon, trading all over the Mediterranean world. The ascendancy of Rome meant that they built a large naval operation, and they began to look for trade routes too. They carried out 3 wars against Carthage. The last one, called Punic War, Punic, P-U-N-I-C, comes from the term Phoenician, by the way. So the Third Punic War in 149, 146 BC, we count backwards, by the way, before Christ. So this was where a Holocaust, a genocide did take place, because the Romans went into Carthage and literally burned it to the ground and killed the vast majority of the population. This is regarded as, well, in the ancient times, as a form of revenge and a contest to see who will prevail as the hegemonic power in the Mediterranean world. And of course, it was Rome. During the Cold War, I should point out, by the way, there were American scholars, Cold War scholars, who embraced the Cold War and the militarism and the nuclear arms race of the Cold War, who compared the race between the US-based Western world order and the communist world order by Russia and China and the non-aligned group back then. So they compared, they argued, it's like being back in Rome during the Republic, the last war. There has to be. And one of the reasons that term back during the Cold War, the term better dead than red, was that the Romans wanted a military solution and death to the last human being and enslavement for whoever was left. And this was the mentality. The issue was obviously one of a sense of superiority, to impose economic, military, political superiority throughout the Mediterranean world and not permit any rival. This sort of mindset exists today in the world order we're in, especially with the rise of China. And with Russia, ever since Russia, of course, as the Soviet Union collapsed and Russia was a weakened skeleton of itself, and under Putin tried to reassert itself as a military power, setting some um, setting some perimeters as to what it will accept with regard to NATO exception, NATO expansion. I'm sorry. From the ancient world, there was another. We're going to jump to the Crusades. The Crusades were papal imperialism, as many historians call it. From the 11th century to the 13th century, what we have are a number of crusades, supposedly to recapture the Holy Land, which three monotheistic religions claim, of course, Islam, Judaism, and Christians, right? The papacy wanted to recapture it. Actually, it was a struggle for trade routes and land. It was a struggle for trade routes and land. And religion was used. Now, religion masked the desire for trade routes and land conquest. One of the crusades had nothing to do with the Holy Land. It was a French crusade from 1209 to 1229, the Albigensian Crusade. There is a region down in the southwest of France near the Pyrenees Mountains. And there was a crusade that was undertaken to wipe out heretics, the Cathars, down there. And the Crusaders were given indulgences. Indulgences are remissions of sin. So kill in the name of God, of Christ, and you will receive remission of sins. Think about that. Think about the moral contradictions in the church offering indulgences to crusaders. And this was not the only crusade that they offered, for which they offered indulgences. All crusades they offer. We'll give you remission of sin. Just go kill some of the enemies, whether they be Muslims. There were also Byzantines, because the Crusaders also invaded Byzantium, or in this case, down in the southwest of France, heretics, the Cathars. So what we have here is another case of a genocide. The estimates of numbers, I have seen up to 1 million killed, by the way. I don't know how many were killed, just as there are wild estimates about the Third Punic War, how many were killed. It's very difficult. I take all these figures with a grain of salt. Anyway, this is another form of genocide, religiously motivated. And again, think about the moral consequences. And the reason I'm mentioning this is because the current genocide in Gaza, whether supported by Christian Zionists or Jewish Zionists, is carried out in the name of God. Genocide in the name of God. Because this Holy Land is meant to go back to the people who rightfully claim it as theirs. Remember, historically, three monotheistic religions, all coming out of the Middle East, by the way, all Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, all coming out of the Middle East, all of them claiming the same place. And many have passed through that region, by the way, which is between Africa and Asia. Many have passed through there and historically have claimed it. Yeah. In any case, the next genocide I want to talk about, which is very significant and very controversial, because in the United States, Black American activists are demanding reparations for this, is the African slave trade. The African slave trade, again, the reparations issue in the United States is very controversial because there are obviously white conservatives who are adamantly against this and react very strongly against just the idea, because it would be admitting that there was genocide committed against Africans who were transported from the continent to become slaves in the Western Hemisphere to strengthen the white-controlled economy. Now, the African slave trade, of course, involved Europeans. Obviously, they were the first, the Portuguese and then the rest of the Europeans, with the British, by the way, the English, carrying out the bulk, about half of the entire transatlantic slave trade that carried out by the British. However, the fact is that it is a transatlantic genocide because millions of people, Black historians, from African to American Black historians, disagree on the numbers. Again, the numbers, you have to take the numbers with a grain of salt because they throw out wild numbers from very low to very high. So, but it doesn't matter. The fact is that it was racially motivated. They targeted people for economic exploitation. They eliminated these people and because they presumed superiority, which is one of the traits of those committing genocide. They presumed superiority from the Romans to Hitler, by the way, to the Nazis and the social Darwinists during the Holocaust. They presume superiority, and unfortunately, some of the Zionists today. Now, the worst example of African genocide came in the late 19th century, early 20th century, when King Leopold II of Belgium controlled the Belgian Congo. The Belgian Congo, I believe, is something like 70 or 80 times larger than Belgium in territory. And the population was roughly 15 million. Again, numbers are not very firm. The king, from 1885 to 1908, reduced the Belgian Congo to a company for profit, for his profit. And there are estimates as to the kinds of money he and his investors made. And again, the estimates run into the hundreds of millions to several billion for that time, by the way. The products that the Belgian Congo offered were rubber, ivory, copper, gold, diamonds. In other words, it was all in the primary sector of production, the extractive industries, and the people working for the corporation under the King of Belgium's control, were the native population. There are actually photographs, okay, of Europeans standing next to Africans who were punished for deviating from the working conditions. Limbs cut, feet amputated, blinded. They tortured them if they didn't fall in line with the working conditions. And we are talking about tortuous working conditions. They worked them very long hours under unsafe and unhealthy conditions, needed to point out, from small children to women and men. And in many cases, killed them. Again, the estimates as to how many natives were killed by the company that the king owned. And he had Europeans, by the way, from Greeks to Italians to Germans to other Europeans working in the company down in the Congo, in the Belgian Congo. The press became reported on this, by the way, back then in the early 20th century, and there was such outrage that the king was pursuing such conditions for the native population that he eventually divested himself of the company. This was another form of genocide. Again, figures vary, but racism, European ethnocentrism, at the forefront, behind it, economic exploitation. Steal their natural resources and use them to produce them and take that to European markets. Okay, let's not forget the motives behind this. The next group that I want to discuss here in genocide, in committing genocide, is Stalin. This is very controversial. Stalin was a Georgian. He wasn't Russian. He wasn't part of the majority. He tried to be more loyal to the Russian majority than to the minorities. One of the minorities he despised were the Ukrainians because they resisted collectivization of farming and state-owned farms. In the early 1930s, he became very harsh toward them and used very extreme measures, including death, to force collectivization. Now, was the motive here racism, ethnocentrism, religious prejudice? None of that. In other words, was the motive what Article 2 of the Geneva Convention 1949 calls for to qualify for genocide? By the way, I forgot to mention, legally, and those of you who watched the proceedings of the ICC, the International Criminal Court, know this if you watch the legal proceedings. With Israel, you know that legally you have to prove motive, and of course you have to prove intent of policy. And it's very difficult to prove it, by the way, and everybody knows that. Everybody knows. Well, that wasn't our intention, and this is one of the reasons that the apologists of genocide, whether it's right now or in previous, argue that, well, these are victims of a general war. It's not intended because we have a sense of superiority, we're ethnocentrists, we're racists, we're prejudiced because they're of a different religion. None of that. They are casualties of war. So it's very difficult, and the court knows it, by the way. The lawyers know that, the court knows that that's very difficult. So how do you prove it? You have to be very, lawyers trying, international lawyers who present the case before the ICC, try to be very specific and find documentation and any kind of empirical evidence and present to the court and say, well, okay, this statement by a high-level official, from Prime Minister on down to the commander of the armed forces, proves that the order was given to eliminate, let's say, an entire village of people, knowing they're unarmed and knowing they're civilians. And the only reason for that, they pose no threat, military threat. It's not a conventional war. Conventional war is war between two armies of comparable means. Two armies. It's not one army against unarmed civilians, including women and children. And as we know, for example, in the case of Israel, 70% of the victims are women and children. So the legal issue becomes complicated. And then when you have, like I said, the minimalist definition of Article 2 of the Geneva Convention versus the broader one, like the Stalin case, well, why isn't, although people, by the way, scholars do agree that Stalin committed genocide, but technically it was policy enforcement for a collectivization of agriculture, collective farms, and for state-owned farms, and they resisted, so they were resisting government policy. So there are loopholes in the law, and those of you who know about the legal system, especially when lawyers present cases in court, they use that to try to prove that we didn't really intend that. Now, the Nazi Holocaust, the worst crime against humanity in the 20th century. The fact is that there has been a long-standing history of anti-Semitism from the Black Death, as Barbara Tuchman in her book A Distant Mirror pointed out, to the expulsion of the Jews from the Iberian Peninsula. Once the Muslims retreated from the Iberian Peninsula around the time of Christopher Columbus, by the way, what happens is there is an expulsion of the Jews, and they wind up in the Ottoman Empire back then, and in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, and what eventually becomes the Russian Empire, after Ivan the Terrible. And you have basically anti-Semitism, predominantly, by the way, not in Muslim countries. I want to stress this because Jewish scholars stress this, not in Muslim countries, but in the Christian world. Anti-Semitism, remember, they were expelled from Catholic Spain, okay? Catholic Spain. Anti-Semitism builds up. During the Black Death, many Christians in the West blamed the Jews for the Black Death, for the plague. This is one of the issues that Barbara Tuchman deals with in her book, A Distant Mirror. Anti-Semitism builds up and really explodes in the 19th century, in the late 19th century, with the pogroms of the Russian Empire, with the expulsion of Jews from, especially in the southern parts of the Ukraine, of the empire. By the way, there were very few Jews allowed within Russia proper. They were confined to the outlying areas. In any event, there was a long-standing anti-Semitism in the West, in France, the famous Dreyfus case. I don't know if people in the 19th century, people are familiar with that, but in Germany as well. And of course, the social Darwinist, which is a pseudo ideology, racist, supremacist ideology that's taken up by the embryonic fascist and eventually Nazi elements that developed in Italy and in Germany, incorporate racism and anti-Semitism, okay, specifically, in order to serve an agenda. Namely, if you just get rid of these people, as Hitler pointed out in Mein Kampf, give the people someone to hate. Don't tell them about the complexities of structural systems, the economy and all that. They don't understand it. They don't care anyway. They want someone to hate. When things are bad, give them someone to hate. Give them the Jews. They know who they are. They have cultural prejudices. Exploit the cultural prejudice. So this is what happened. There was a cultural milieu, cultural background, an environment of anti-Semitism that the state institutionalized with a final solution, which is, of course, the Holocaust. Obviously, 6 million were eliminated with the tolerance, by the way, and the full knowledge. The tolerance, I'm saying this, not that they collaborate, but the fact is that the Western allies knew about it. There were planes that were going very close to the camps and would not bomb the camps. It is also true that the infrastructure for the concentration camps was made possible by corporations, from construction companies to chemical companies. These things took place because of the collaboration of elements outside the SS and the Gestapo. The fact is, all this was made possible also with the knowledge. One of the reasons that Dwight Eisenhower, who was a general, the commanding officer, by the way, of the forces in Europe, said, because he was of German background, said that he was ashamed after he saw the results of the Holocaust, that he was ashamed of being of German background, is because he knew that this was taking place. Besides, the West rejected, when Hitler had a window of shipping off a number of Jews, saying, okay, leave, let's see who'll take you. US did not. A number of Western countries did not. Okay. The Holocaust was also targeting gypsies. They eliminated, again, the figures are from at least 500,000 up and up. Communists and resistance fighters, anyone who resisted, obviously, the Third Reich. So there was a genocide-wide policy with the Jews at the core. Let's not forget that that's a crime against humanity. And then gypsies, the Romani people, the Roma, and others, including, like I said, communists and resistance fighters. And the Nuremberg trial did, at the end of the war, did try to address this issue of what happens in the future, because a lot of the German officers that came, they took the stands. Well, I was just getting orders. What do you want from me? And the Geneva Convention comes after this and takes some of this into account when they designed the criteria for what constitutes genocide. This is the reason I'm mentioning all of this. Now we come to some of the modern post-World War II. From Serbia to Rwanda to Cambodia or Kampuchea, the Cambodian genocide, to obviously what's going on today. I don't have time, because I see we're already 50 minutes into this session, to cover all of that. But clearly, in the case of Rwanda, it was a tribal conflict that where, again, the numbers vary, and there the Rwanda situation has some common elements with the one in Cambodia. Both were former colonies, and both carried the legacy of colonialism, and both were manipulated by external actors. The Khmer Rouge situation under Pol Pot in the 1970s is an interesting one, because of the Vietnam War and because of a power struggle between China, Russia, and the United States, manipulating events and inadvertently finding themselves at least the Chinese and the US, supporting the Khmer Rouge, who were eliminating their own people. Now, the Khmer Rouge were not eliminating their own people for ethnic prejudice or religious or any of that. The fact is, they came in, found a debilitated state, and wanted to create a strong state structure and impose agrarian communism under a very dogmatic system. Pol Pot had very dogmatic nationalist/communist model, and he began very harsh policies toward its own population in order to strengthen the state structure, while at the same time, of course, like I said, inadvertently, behind the scenes, we have China, which was against Russia, and the US against Russia, and also the US wanted revenge against Vietnam. Vietnam wanted to bring in line the Khmer Rouge. Eventually, the Khmer Rouge ended this because Vietnam intervened, by the way, and brought an end to this by 1979. The Khmer Rouge situation is rather complicated. It requires a whole session just by itself. It is sad, those of you who have seen a motion picture called The Killing Fields, I forget what decade it was made, but a long time ago. A rather emotional film, a very commercial film. But, you know, it has some issues that are important. It raises some important issues in there. But the Khmer Rouge situation also raises the question of whether the Geneva Convention is sufficient, Article 2 of the Geneva Convention is sufficient to cover this particular case, because there are those who don't, by the way, and there are revisionists. I just recently read, I haven't finished the book, but there's a book which it has a revisionist. The scholar is definitely against, obviously, what the Khmer Rouge did, what the Pol Pot regime did. But he has a revisionist view of why these things happened, and takes a holistic view. Let's look at everything here. And it is much more complicated than it seems. Nevertheless, you have the result of several million dead. And that's the only thing that matters, by the way. In the end, that is a crime, and it's a crime against humanity. Now let's come to, in the last few minutes that we have, let's come to the situation today. Here we have a situation where the world, on a daily basis, sees pictures, videotape, reads about this, what happens in Gaza. And right now, after the assassination of Ismail Haniyeh, after the situation of the head of the Politburo of Hamas in Tehran, there is enormous tension, because the supreme commander of Iran has stated that there must be a response to Israel for what happened in Tehran, to the Politburo chief of Hamas, an Iranian-based group. Meanwhile, since that assassination, the actions of Israel have intensified in Gaza and the West Bank. They have bombed hospitals, schools, they have hit civilian centers right and left. They have continued the weaponizing water and food. And all along, the US is arguing that it wants to see some evidence that what happened here from Israel, from the people who are carrying this out, with regard to the Politburo of Hamas. And even when a State Department official was asked by a journalist, okay, this person was assassinated. Let's assume we don't know who did it. Let's assume we don't know who did it. Who do you negotiate with? Because he was supposed to negotiate a ceasefire deal. Obviously, they have others. Killing one individual does not mean the end of the Palestinian struggle for freedom and sovereignty, by the way. That's delusional thinking. It just means that killing that individual is a manifestation of a desire to continue genocide. That's all. That's all it means. However, the situation could get out of hand. The worst possible scenario, there's a worst possible scenario and there's a best possible scenario. The best possible scenario is that the US, helped by the Chinese, which they said, yeah, we will welcome them, helped by the Chinese, who have enormous influence with Iran, by the way, because of the Chinese economic influence in Iran, may be persuaded to offer some kind of a deal to Iran and then ask Israel to back off and forge some kind of a ceasefire. That's the best possible scenario. I don't see it. The worst possible scenario is nuclear war in the region. And if nuclear bombs drop in the region, they impact everyone else around the region, the entire Middle East and southern Mediterranean. Okay, that's the worst, and that is headed toward general war. So this genocide has the potential that's being carried out there, and the U.S., by the way, is sending planes and ships and submarines to support Israel in case there is an armed conflict, a general war, right? It's hedging its bets. I am positive that they're frantically working for a diplomatic solution. But I also look at what they're doing. They are sending their forces to the region, more reinforcements they already have down in Crete, on the island of Crete in Greece. They have a huge naval base, by the way. They can operate out of Cyprus. They operate out of a number of areas in the Middle East. If you look at a map and see a map where there are military bases in the Middle East, you'll see the American flag spread throughout the southern Mediterranean and the Middle East. So this has the potential of a disaster globally. So this genocide is not only a crime against humanity, it has the potential of exploding in the face of humanity and dragging humanity into chaos. And for what? Because of a messianic dream of those who support Zionism, whether they're Jews or Christians. Is that it? They can't achieve peace and coexistence in the absence of militarism as a way of life. This is the tragedy of this, that forever war doctrine that the United States neoconservatives are pursuing is actually converges with what Israel is doing. So it's not Israel, actually. It's the United States that permits this because there is convergence between the goals of Israel and the goals of the United States, economic and geopolitical. Okay, this would not be happening if the master puppeteer did not want this to happen. Now, it's true that the AIPAC, the lobbyists, the billionaires, Jewish and non-Jewish billionaires pouring money into campaign funds, yes, they do that. But the question is, do you risk humanity's future for all of this? Is that it? We risk the future of humanity? And what, again, What moral authority will the West have down the road when another country commits genocide and then turns around and says, but look at you, you didn't accept the ICC decision, you didn't accept any international law directives, you didn't recognize the World Court. Why should we abide by international law when you don't, and you only talk about democracy and freedom and the rule of law, but you're the violators of all that? I thank you for watching and listening, and I invite you to become subscribers to this channel that Assad Alim manages. This is an educational channel. Assad Alim is an individual of the highest integrity, committed to educational issues. His only interest is the edification of the viewer and listener, and he promotes issues that contribute to the cultural understanding and political and economic understanding of the audience. Thank you, and we'll have another session soon. Thank you very much.